Welcome everybody. I'm Nanci Bell, and this is the fourth in the series of your Great Learning Adventure, where I am answering questions that you have sent in for me to answer. I'm excited to have this opportunity to talk with all of you. We have lots of questions that come in, and I'm going to start with a quick review of who we are and what we do, because my answers are relative to that and not something else that may be in the field of education. I'm speaking to you directly from what I know, what I've experienced for 30 years in working with thousands of students, and what our data says. So after that, then I'm going to share with you my response to 5 questions on topics of dyslexia, dysgraphia, executive function, written language expression, our testing battery, and observation in our learning centers. So here's the quick review. The underlying cause of weak language and literacy skills is at the sensory level. It's not, in my opinion, that is the primary reason for difficulty with language and literacy skills. And we see that when a student is not doing well in school, and we have students that range from age 5 all the way into adults, but if we look at this pipeline here, and the majority of the students that we see come to us from experiencing some sort of difficulty in school. And so just to make sure you're all clear on what I'm talking about here, this is kindergarten, first grade, second grade, etc. We see that when students are not being successful in school, that there's 2 primary weaknesses. It can be a variety of other things, but these are the 2 primary ones, and that's weak decoding skills and weak comprehension skills. It could be also math, it could be written language expression, which I think that we also see and work with in instructional programs, but these are the 2 primary ones. The issue for us is that there's one primary cause, and that is weakness in the imagery language connection. It is that we believe that you have to have an imagery language foundation in order to process language and literacy skills. So a long time ago, I said that the sensory input of imagery underlies language and literacy skills. And you see that that's me teaching a workshop, and I wrote on the board, visualize. And it's very interesting to me that after all these years, there's now someone in the United Kingdom who has identified weak visual imagery, and he calls it aphantasia. In adults, at this point, that's what he's saying. And we've been talking about this for a long time, and we'll be speaking at that conference soon. As we began to look at imagery and its relationship to comprehension, and then indeed its relationship to decoding, I'm going to be talking about both of those things and answering your questions. The experience that we had in working with students one-on-one actually matched a theory of cognition, and that's called dual coding theory, and you can read that for yourself there. What's probably the most important statement is the one on the bottom, and that is where Dr. Pavio says, this is a general theory of cognition. He says, performance is mediated by the joint activity of verbal and nonverbal systems. This is language, and this is imagery. Your nonverbal system, as he's talking about it. Cognition, and this is extremely important for you to get as I go through these questions. Cognition is always an interplay between the verbal and the nonverbal systems. And we certainly found that experientially with students. What was interesting, and I've met Dr. Pavio, he's become a friend of mine, and what's interesting that was not identified in what he said is that in working with students, we found that there's 2 types of imagery. There's imagery that seems to visualize or make mental representations for parts, and then there's imagery that makes mental representations for the gestalt, movies, if you want to think of it that way. This one is symbol imagery for sounds and letters within words, and this one is concept imagery for oral and written language, to form a mental image of the whole. Now, always when I'm talking to you, I'm wanting you to understand that reading is not really as complicated as we tend to think it is. There are component parts of reading. And I put this together so that these could whip in for you. These 3 inner circles, what I call subsets, this is a Venn diagram, they're subsets of the greater set of comprehension. This is word attack, this is word recognition, contextual reading and vocabulary. I want you to be thinking of, this is phonological processing, this is orthographic processing. Now, I want to put that framework of the Venn diagram. So we've got word attack skills, word recognition skills, paragraph reading, all part of the greater whole of being able to comprehend, which is obviously the only reason to read. Is not, there's no intrinsic value in being able to decode a word if that word doesn't turn into something meaningful for your brain. So, and there's certainly no value in being able to read fast and not comprehend, or read accurately, decode accurately and not comprehend. Everything has to go back up to comprehension. So I think that for me, it is that there is this language processing spectrum, and think of it as decoding and comprehension. And when there's weak decoding, weakness in these skills in here, it can be labeled, if it's weak enough and it fits the description, the definition, then it could be labeled as dyslexia. And a very easy way to think of dyslexia, because there's been a lot of confusing things said about dyslexia, and I'm going to show you a definition of dyslexia. The easiest way to think of dyslexia is that it is the difficulty someone might have, whether it's a young student or an adult, reading words to his or her potential. That's the easiest way to think of it. So the student has potential here, the individual has potential here, but their decoding is down here. Their vocabulary might be down here, but their ability to decode a word is here. And if you now think of those as those subsets are critical to comprehension, then we have to say, is it that everybody that reads accurately can comprehend? And that's certainly not true. And that's one of the things that I stumbled onto a long time ago in working with a college student who was labeled dyslexic and failing in school. He was on academic probation. And in working with that young man, even though he couldn't decode the words accurately, when I asked him to comprehend, I read a paragraph and comprehend it, actually it was a full page, he had unbelievable comprehension. And I looked at him and I said, how are you able to do that? And he said, I make movies when I read. And that was my first, years and years ago, my first step into the world of imagery, which I am still fascinated with to this day. So one of the things that we have found is that you can have weak symbol imagery. Remember I said that there's two types of imagery. Take you back there for a second. And that would impact you, and that's going to impact those subsets. And then you can have weak concept imagery. Let me just say CI for concept imagery, SI for symbol imagery. And that is going to impact your comprehension if you cannot make mental representations for the languages that comes in. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go and as I'm answering questions. When this is weak enough, and it's kind of the hidden challenge that individuals experience, when that's weak enough, or when it's just moderately weak, somebody may not even be aware that they have what I think is of as a learning challenge, and that learning challenge stems from some weakness in the sensory system and imaging. But if it's really severely weak, often those individuals can have the label of hyperlexia or autism. So keep that in mind as our framework for all the stuff that I'm going to say about answering questions. So here we go. As we look at Lindamood-Bell, at the students that come to us, we are always looking at this gestalt, the 35,000-foot view that we're looking at for students to try to make an accurate diagnosis and do differentiated instruction for that diagnosis, because every child is not the same. So we're diagnosing to find the cause. And the first question that I had was, Are Lindamood-Bell tests accepted by schools and other institutions for purposes of assessing help, accommodations, and resources? And the answer is yes. Our learning ability evaluation, which we in-house call our LAE, is a battery of nationally normed tests compiled from numerous experts in the field of cognition, language, and literacy processing. We ourselves have contributed only 2 measures to that sensory cognitive processing to our battery of approximately 20 tests. So it's important that you know that we did not make up our own tests and then teach to our own tests to make our data look good. We in fact used nationally normed tests to quantify our gains. And the last thing I put on this slide was that most of the tests are used by schools and research institutions. And so I'm just going to quickly show you that there's a variety of tests that we go through. It takes anywhere from 3 to 5 hours to do these tests. Question 2, can parents observe sessions at our clinics, at your clinics? My son is 5 years old and has autism with very limited verbal ability. I think your program could really benefit him, but I would like to stay with him or view through a window. Thank you. And my answer is yes, you can observe. It may be appropriate for you to observe or be involved with instructional sessions. You will become part of his instructional team. So it's an easy question for me to answer. Now, let's go back to this the imagery and the language processing spectrum. And the third question that I'm going to answer comes on this side. And that is, so therefore, hang on a second. Therefore, we're going to look more closely at what symbol imagery is. So you know that I'm saying that it is that you can visualize sounds and letters in words. And so there's a picture of Buzz doing that. But I'm going to have you experience it with me just for a second. In fact, I'm going to do this to the adults at the United Kingdom that say they can't visualize when I go and speak at that conference. So take a look at that, and I'm going to take it away, and all of you that are watching, there's apparently hundreds of you, tell me the 4th letter that you pictured. And what I'm asking you to do is to retrieve from memory, by using your symbol imagery, which is your orthographic memory, to tell me that you saw an N. You could retrieve it. So that's what symbol imagery is. Now, how is that relevant? The mental representation involved in orthographic processing was termed by Airy as an orthographic image. An orthographic image can be scanned in memory, contains all the letters in the word spelling, and serves as the symbols for both spoken and silent sounds. So keep all that in your mind, because now we're going to look at dyslexia and dysgraphia, because question 3 was one of the more difficult ones for me to answer in with just a short few slides. I have a son with dysgraphia as well as dyslexia, sequential memory problems, and low processing speed. What kind of success could a student with both of these types of diagnosis have on your programs? My son is 10 years old. Is it just better to let them use accommodations all the time? He was just evaluated on Saturday, so I get his results on Tuesday. I'm hoping that your programs will help him in some way. Thanks. So in order to answer this question, I have to make sure that we're all on the same page, kind of the lack of clarity about dysgraphia. For me, years ago, dysgraphia simply meant that it was a deficiency in the ability to form a letter. But now it's expanded a little bit beyond that. But here's 3 definitions. Dysgraphia is a deficiency in the ability to write, primarily handwriting, but also coherence. That's not anything that I ever thought about related to dysgraphia, because I don't think that it is. I think that if you're dysgraphic, you're going to have difficulty forming the letters, holding the pencil, etc. So this next one says a little bit more about that. Dysgraphia is a transcription disability. I agree with that. Meaning that is a writing disorder associated with impaired handwriting, orthographic coding, orthography, the storing process of written words and processing letters in those words, and finger sequencing, the movement of muscles required to write. I agree that's a better definition. It often overlaps with other learning disabilities such as speech impairment, attention deficit disorder, or developmental coordination disorder. So let's look at dyslexia. Now, years ago, I was actually giving a keynote address in Scotland. And as I was listening to the person that went on before me, and this was Pat Lindamood and I were there, she said that the symptoms of dyslexia were varied, one of them being that you would have difficulty programming your VCR. And Pat and I looked at one another and went, wow, that was absolutely not true, and it was misleading. And it's taken some time for there to be some clarity about the definition of dyslexia. So here's one from the National Institutes of Health. Dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurological in origin. It is characterized by difficulties with accurate and/or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. These difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language. And I can tell you that Pat Lindamood and her test on what she first called auditory conceptualization, then became later phonological awareness, actually contributed to this definition. That is often unexpected in relation to other, this is what's critical, unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities. Remember I said that. And the provision of effective classroom instruction. I'm not so sure I agree with that. Secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience that can impede growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. Well, obviously, that if you cannot decode, then you're going to have difficulty with reading comprehension and maybe garnering vocabulary and background knowledge. Where I'm going to take you as I answer this is that I think that dyslexia is not caused by a deficit in only phonological awareness. I think that it is also caused by a deficit in the ability to create mental representations. I am wholly bought into that what Pavio said is right, that cognition, and certainly reading is a cognitive skill, is always an interplay between our nonverbal and our verbal, our language and our imagery systems. So I think that there's no question that it can be there can be a phonological component, but that is not the only part of it. So with that in mind, and back to our subsets that would be related to this young man, this, remember I said, is phonological awareness, and this is, or phonological processing, this is orthographic processing. All of those are these components that need to be filled in order for you to be able to read competently and confidently. However, what I want to point out to you is that if the primary component that we do, especially if we're just working on phonological awareness, what we will get is this circle well developed, and that will result in analytical reading rather than filling all of these in and resulting in global reading, which means that I can recognize those words instantly like that, and that allows me to flow across the page. Probably the best phonological awareness program that I know is our program. I guess I'm biased, and it's called LIPS, and it is where we activate articulatory feedback to verify phonemes within words and allow that verification to be applied to word attack skills. The reason that we moved into also developing symbol imagery for orthographic processing is that we needed to make sure that we produced global readers and not just readers that were filling in that gap or that circle. So I put this slide in there because it's important. Orthographic processing involves orthographic coding. Remember that what we want this young man to become is a global reader, not an analytical reader. And that requires orthographic processing, not just phonological processing. So here's what Berninger said. Orthographic processing involves orthographic coding, described as representing a printed word in memory and accessing the whole word unit, a component letter, or a letter cluster. That is extremely important for establishing sight words. And sight words have to be in place in order to be a global reader before you can read in paragraphs and read fluently. Got it? is really not complicated, actually. Okay, so how does symbol imagery, now looking at this objectively, how does symbol imagery relate to measures of phoneme awareness? And this was an important question for me and for us. This is looking at measures of phonological processing compared to the symbol imagery test, and the magnitude is very large. So symbol imagery and phonological awareness are comparable, or let's see, correlated. It's very significant. But more important is symbol imagery predicting or predictive of word attack skills, word recognition skills, spelling, reading rate, reading accuracy, all those circles that I was showing you. This is with an N of 717 students. And the short answer to this, so I can keep moving us along, is it is more predictive than the measures of phonological awareness. Right here, this is a stepwise regression analyzing the symbol imagery test compared to our LAC test and compared to Torgerson's tests. It is highly, highly predictive. And I can send you all that data if you would like it. Now, all of that's well and good. But what happens when we work with our students with symbol imagery only that have been identified with dyslexia? And that was part of the question that was asked of me. This is with an N of 1,234 students. The average hours of instruction this was only 110 hours of instruction. So if you're thinking of these students, this is first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade, etc. Look at the changes that are made by stimulating the brain's ability to make mental representations for sounds and letters and words and applying that over to all of those subsets. Word attack, word rec, paragraph reading. So here is the students that they come to us with a pre-label of dyslexia. This is the gain in percentiles, pre and post percentiles, the pre, this is the post, in their ability to visualize letters. Well, that's obviously statistically significant, and it should be. We teach to that test. We actually have students visualize letters, take them away, and that's similar to what the test is like, so I would expect that to be high. What we don't do ever with these students, we never give them, this is our LAC test, and it's a test where you use little colored blocks to represent the sounds that you hear within syllables. They never see those blocks from the time that they were pre-tested to the time that they were post-tested. We never do anything that would look like that test, and these gains are extremely significant. So absolutely, what we're doing with symbol imagery is applying or impacting significantly their phonological awareness. And you can look at their word attack skills, their word recognition skills, etc., including their comprehension. This is just another way to look at that. This is with standard scores. And when you look at a standard score, it means that you're showing, this is the mean, that these scores are now coming closer to the mean. Very exciting. This is accuracy, fluency, comprehension, word attack, phonological awareness, word recognition. The purple means that these are large changes. Now let's look at dysgraphia. Now these are students that we saw. We did symbol imagery only, but look at how our N drops. Now this is years of data for us as compared to 1,200 students that came in with a pre-diagnosis of dyslexia. We only have 30 students that we could get from our data that had a label of dysgraphia. But you can also see here that we changed their phonological awareness, we changed their word recognition. All of these are significant changes pre and post. And if we look at it on standard scores, it's also very large changes. And again, only 109 hours of direct stimulation. But I believe the question to me was that this man's son was diagnosed with both dysgraphia and dyslexia. So I asked our research and development department, our R&D department, to get me whatever we had on students that came to us with both, a diagnosis of both, You can see that the N drops again, but you can see that we also are making significant changes in reading accuracy, even spelling, word recognition, and there it is in standard score changes. Before I left this man's question, and we were talking about dyslexia, I wanted to show another slide that these are our SI only students, and I isolated just their word attack, but I broke it into mild weakness, moderate weakness, and then this is of course a severe weakness. So I think it's important to look beyond just the mean, just the average of students, because you're going to have some that are going to be very high and some that are very low. And I wanted to really look very specifically at what happens for those students that are in that severe category. I wanted you to see that. It's very, very impressive. This is with only 108 hours. They have gone from the 6th percentile to the 37th percentile in word attack skills with symbol imagery only. And then if you look at the same students, now word recognition, you can see that we've got large standard score changes for the group that are mild, the moderate, but the most impressive thing in here is the students that had really severe word recognition deficits responded the best. Same thing with paragraph accuracy. Here's the severe group. That's their reading accuracy. And this is really impressive. This is life-changing for these students. They can now comprehend it probably above the mean, is what that would be showing you. The last thing I wanted to answer about this question, and I've shown this slide in some of my other presentations, but it's a very important slide because this one is looking at gray matter volume changes following intervention with dyslexic children, and those children were worked with symbol imagery. It was only 8 weeks, and those improvements in reading ability were accompanied by changes in brain structure. And although I have more slides on this, and you can always email us and get any of this data, this was written up in NeuroImage. This is what I think what is probably the most important. It's not just that we showed the volume change. It was in 4 areas of the brain, and these included memory and mental imagery. But the most important thing for me was that those changes maintained or increased after the intervention. They did a pre-testing. We didn't do it, they did it. Pre-testing, they did post-intervention testing, and then they waited, and they did another testing, and the changes on the graph were just startling. They either stayed the same or they increased. So that says that something significant did change at the neurological level. So now I want to answer just a few more questions. We're going to go to question 4. I'm going to bring you back to this one because we're now going to turn our attention to comprehension. And I put a slide in here that I wanted to make sure we're all on the same page what weak concept imagery is. It is the phenomena of whether it's oral language or written language where it goes in one ear, seemingly, and out the other. And when individuals, adults, children, college students have this happen, what was very interesting to me is that they tend to get parts. It took me some time to figure this out. They tend to get parts. They remember dates and facts. But what these individuals had difficulty doing was processing a whole, or the gestalt. And so what we do with the visualizing verbalizing program, I'll refer to as Vivi as you see me answer this question, is that we develop through a series of steps that imaged whole, and then we apply that imaged gestalt to higher order thinking skills. So I just put one slide in here about our VV only students. This is with 102 hours, and I only want to show you the results of the severe category. I have certainly a lot of data on the mild and the moderate where they're not as significantly impaired. These students that are severe come in at the 8th percentile in reading comprehension, and after 102 hours, they go to the 47th percentile. And you should gasp when you see that. Because after 102 hours, what I'm saying to you is that we can stimulate mental imagery that results in improved reading comprehension. And this is exactly what I'm going to say in our presentation in the United Kingdom next week. that you may have labeled this aphantasia. We've been working with this for a long time. It is not a lifelong disability, and neither is dyslexia. Here's vocabulary changes. I also want to point out, pre-testing shows these students coming at the 39th percentile in oral vocabulary, but at the 8th percentile in reading comprehension, and all of these students read in this category above the 85th percentile in decoding skills. So it was definitely not vocabulary or decoding. So question 4, that's our setup for question 4. I have used Vivi for many years with much success in reading comprehension. My question has to do with students who have expressive language problems or dysgraphia. I have noticed it seems to help them express ideas, and I think the "it" refers to Vivi, to help them express ideas clearly and get it on paper. Is there any research to back this up? I think that picturing helps language flow. What is your opinion? I think you probably know what my opinion is. Yes, in order to write, you have to be able to think. You don't write from your pencil. Your pencil doesn't do it. Your hand doesn't do it. It's neurological. It's what you're able to process in your brain. It's how you're able to think. That is a famous statement, I believe, by Strunk. Concept imagery, and this is me, is a primary sensory cognitive foundation for critical and logical thinking. Concept imagery is the imaged whole, the gestalt, that enables you to organize and express your thoughts, oral and written, in a logical and sequential fashion. So now if we look at just for written language expression, again, if our girl, and I think that this is actually Sophie that I wrote about in one of my books, when she has been able to create mental representations for whole paragraphs, we then actually with Vivi apply that to written language. We don't ask Sophie to write before she can actually process that gestalt. So I queried our data, and this is on the test of written language. These are Vivi only students because that was what the question was. This is with an average of 89 hours. It's an N of 92. And you can see that in convention, language, this is where Vivi would be very effective here. It is your coherence of it. And then the one over here is a combination of all of them. You can see that we get good changes in that. I will tell you that if you brought me a student that was able to do more than 89 hours of Vivi, we could probably change those scores even higher. Oftentimes what happens to us is that we get 4 to 6 weeks with a student, 4 hours a day of intensive treatment, and at the end of Vivi, when we've improved their comprehension and now we want to apply it over to written language comprehension, we don't have enough time to get into some of the things. I think that we could even punch these scores higher. But still, they're good. Question 5, and the last one. Will this program be able to help an older child with slow processing speed and weak executive functions? My son is a sophomore in high school taking advanced classes in AP, just wondering if this is worthwhile pursuing and if the program can cater to teenagers. So there's actually, I thought 2 questions in there. We'll take the first one at executive function. Executive functions are a set of cognitive processes including attention control, inhibitory control, working memory, and cognitive flexibility, as well as reasoning, problem solving, and planning that are needed for cognitive control of behavior. And there's a lot of definitions of executive function. I found one that I almost put in here from Harvard University, but it was probably a little too simple for us, so I decided to go with the medium one. I was sure that you could understand this. It is a set of cognitive processes including attention control, inhibitory control, working memory, cognitive flexibility, etc. So my answer to that is we have reason to believe that executive function, EF, issues are related to weak concept imagery. And if you look at some of the issues that they were bringing up there, you can see that if you're having difficulty processing the world around you in terms of concepts, you're going to experience some difficulty with reasoning and language comprehension. But I think also that we can show that what we are doing is related to working memory. So our internal data on students previously identified with EF shows Vivi instruction, just Vivi, results in significant gains in language comprehension. So here's that profile. These average hours are 138. It's 1,400, I was very surprised, 1,400 students that we saw. It's interesting, look how low they were coming in on I had not seen this data before, on language comprehension compared to vocabulary. I mean, this vocabulary 25th percentile is considered the bottom of normal. They were almost at normal here, but this is a severe weakness. And this is an enormous change. They're the same students, only in standard scores. I thought the second part of this question was, do Lindamood-Bell programs, do you have any data showing that our programs are effective with teenagers? And so I queried the data on that, and this is ages 13 through 19. These are decoding and comprehension. I have lots of data. I can look at decoding only, I can look at comprehension only, I can look at math, etc. I just lumped all this together because it's kind of it's germane to this presentation, and you can see that the gains are very good. And I wanted to leave you on this question, I wanted to leave you with these thoughts that we have been invited to participate in a behavioral study with UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles, to examine the effects of Vivi on students diagnosed with executive function issues. We hypothesized that the language comprehension gains for the study population will be comparable to the gains we have seen with our internal population. I would be surprised if it wasn't, but that's why you do research. We look forward to data regarding measurable and quantifiable changes in working memory also, so stay tuned. Remember that as we have migrated through these questions, that we always come back to this general theory of cognition. Cognition is always an interplay between the verbal and the nonverbal systems. And I put something as the end of my presentation that Alpavio wrote in 2007. And I'm going to read it to you because he is probably one of the geniuses of our time. I accept the obvious truism that language played a critical role in our giant leap as a species. But language never worked its magic alone, and it cannot do so now. Instead, it has always depended on a silent partner that provides it with something to talk about, a general cognitive system that had evolved to a high level before it invited language in as a co-player in the evolutionary scene. I see language as a benevolent octopus-like parasite whose tentacles invaded the brain and was never empowered by it to survive and thrive to the point where it could contribute something useful to its host. Nonverbal mind and verbal mind thus became interlocked in a synergistic relation that evolved into the nuclear power source of our intellect. I couldn't agree more. That's it for me. I always want you to remember that what we're looking for, because I had a question about accommodations, what we're looking for at Lindamood-Bell is independence that's based on the ability to self-correct, that's based on the ability to monitor, that's based on the sensory input of imagery, that nonverbal code that Alpavia was talking about. Thank you very much. On behalf of Pat Lindamood and myself, we feel lucky to have been doing this for all these years. Thanks.